I'm sorry, I had my sound off. Have you turned it over to
Oh,
me?
no, not yet. I was
Okay,
about to introduce you.
go ahead.
Yeah, so our first speaker this afternoon is Robert Pippin, who's Evelyn Stevenson Neff Distinguished Service Professor at University of Chicago. He has written many influential books and papers on Hegel and other figures in the German tradition, among which is his recent study of the science of logic called Hegel's Realm of Shadows. He has also written extensively on film philosophy, and his two recent books in that field are Filmed Thought and a volume on Douglas Sirk. So his talk today is titled Hegel, Allegiance, and the Problem of Ethical Standing.
Thank you very much. Thank you to Dean and Kate and Sebastian for organizing this wonderful tribute to Terry, which I'm very, very happy to participate in, having learned so much from our correspondence and from his work for 30 years now. I became struck in starting to write this paper by something I hadn't noticed quite as focally before, which is Hegel's, let's say, very deep hesitancies about the realizability of his own version of ethical life as he himself presented it. And this in terms of topics that aren't directly connected with the more famous problems later commentators point out, like the problem of poverty or the inevitability of war or monarch. In one sense, the more radical way to put what I'm trying to say is that the genius of the philosophy of right is not that it failed, but that somehow or other, despite contrary tendencies, Hegel saw that it had to fail, that he stages its own self-undermining. And this, in terms of a desideratum in any just society that hadn't, I think, been taken seriously enough in much Hegel reception, to make this fit in the time limits, I'm not going to read the introductory part about what I consider the uniqueness of Hegel's approach to political philosophy, but problem 4, or point 4 in that, is something I need to stress, which is that our socially dependent and historically self-transformative natures means that our experience of a great desideratum in Hegel, mutuality or equality, can't be merely formal or legal. And that's the basis of his insistence that modern institutions must somehow embody the experience of equal standing and respect among participants. For it's only out of such an experience that allegiance is possible. Just consider the moment of subjective life, the subjective moment of ethical life as it's described by Hegel, a state of non-alienation, he says, where the subject, quote, bears spiritual witness to them, its institutions and laws, as to its own essence, in which it has its self-feeling, Selbstgefühl. Just as it's one thing to believe in a pagan religion and another thing, as he says, to be a pagan, it's one thing to be persuaded in a belief about liberal democracy and coming to be a liberal Democrat. Controversially, he doesn't seem to think this requires full material equality, although it is inconsistent with extreme inequalities in material well-being, which introduces a kind of sliding scale. But it requires the experience of recognitive respect. I'm not sure, and I'm not sure how Hegel is sure, that social institutions like the ones Stephen was just talking about, like corporations and the states, could help in the accomplishment of this desideratum for cognitive respect. And that's really the source of a lot of the questions in the paper, since it's certainly quite possible that the character of neoliberal globalized finance capitalism would make such a search within the general confines of modern ethical life futile. And if it was futile, that would count as a profound Hegelian injustice, not just a marginalized view about how people feel about themselves or problem of self-esteem. But for me, this particularly comes in what he says about work. And this is especially in the lectures prior to the philosophy of right, or during the entirety of the 1820s. Since what struck me was that Hegel's concerns about the organization of labor in early market economies already reflects quite a remarkable pessimism that any reformist approach to those problems would be possible. So, for example, a factory presents a sad picture of the deadening, the Abstumpfung, of human beings, which is also why on Sundays, factory workers lose no time in spending and squandering their entire weekly wages, unquote. Something that could have been written by Marx or almost was in those terms, written by Marx in the manuscripts. And he appears to mean factory work as such. And that's an element of Hegel's work that is relatively unexplored. And it's not restricted to industrial factories, as any good account of the daily grind of Amazon or Walmart workers or nursing home attendants or telemarketers will make clear. I mean, I'm very influenced here by the work of the extraordinarily pioneering work of Elizabeth Anderson in making clear the way in which corporations exercise power outside the political sphere, but in a way that makes the achievement of this mutuality of respect extremely difficult to imagine. Now, within the realm of civil society, of course, as everyone has been pointing out, the realm of agents pursuing their unique ends is, quote, boundless, extravagant, and the forms of this extravagance are themselves boundless. The realm of civil society consists of social interactions grounded in the contingent particular needs of distinct individuals. But merely strategic reasoning, taking others into unavoidable account only to achieve one's own unique ends, would not rise to any level of ethical significance. It wouldn't qualify as an exemplification of the true universality of the demands of freedom, being with oneself in another, somewhat more existentially comprehensible than the logical particularity, individuality, universality that we've been talking. His frequent examples of what realized freedom are love and friendship. This makes it very important that labor can be one of those elements of civil society that Hegel considers to be built into educative. Labor is a vehicle of self-actualization, the confirmation of one's distinct talents and individuality. Workers come to understand a substantive and universal norm that all amounts to Hegel's case for the partial and circumscribed rationality of civil society, and so the ethical significance of the modern economy. As he puts it, quote, the principles of particularity pass over into universality through this educative process, and only in the latter does it have its truth and right positive actuality, unquote. And the education it effects is, quote, therefore liberation and work towards a higher liberation. He means that the way I direct and limit my pursuits is not determined solely by my individual self-interest, but comes to be, the way he always puts it, mediated, suffused by a consciousness of a universal principle that binds all rational beings. This universality is still not adequate. That's why we need a liberation to a higher actuality, but it's a version of a common interest, not full ethical universality, but he still calls it versöhnend, conciliatory. As noted, what Hegel would call a mediated identification. This is what Hegel would call a mediated identification with the various ways in which one comes to have standing in the eyes of others, not just another self-serving bargainer, but a member first of a Stände or class, a mediated universal, acknowledged as necessary for the well-being and self-respect of all, the agricultural, manufacturing, and what he calls the universal class, most prominent in the civil servants, who rise to such significance in Hegel's account, and as members of various corporations, associations largely defined, not exclusively, by work roles within which one also has standing as, say, a carpenter, a cooper, a teacher, a skilled laborer, or administrator of any kind. As Hegel puts it, the universality at issue, quote, is the quality of being recognized, is the moment which makes isolated and abstract needs, means, and modes of satisfactions into concrete, that is, social ones. And this recognition, quote, involves the requirement of equality, unquote. Again, Hegel points out that this is still a limited conception in the stake we have in each other, and still more of a commonality of interest as a limited universal. And he certainly defends some regulatory connection by the Polizei, the Rechtspflege, between entitlement rights and welfare in a very general sense, including the right to work at a minimum. However, very little of this notion of ethical standing or genuine recognition of worth is addressed by mere minimal welfarism. And he goes well beyond in his accounts of the negative and unethical aspects of life in a modern economy than in any way that could be satisfied by minimal welfarism. Even though he does defend a certain kind of intervention in the economy, it's quite is quite limited and, as Stephen was emphasizing, not really directed by the political state, but by the Polizei and the institutions of Rechtspflege in civil society. Because it's only as at the level of a political identification as fellow citizens that this universality and a finally satisfying form, the Selbstgefühl standard of recognition, is possible. The strict distinction between the political state and civil society, of course, is a foundation in Hegel's whole approach, but it does raise, because of the way he sets this up, it raises a number of problems for life in civil society for which state intervention or even Polizei intervention doesn't seem relevant or a possible response to the problem. Now, one of the problems here, of course, is that Hegel, on the one hand, like so many early theorists of a market economy, imagined a domain of craft and production that assumes a certain scale: self-owned small businesses, industrial production that makes use of the distinctive talents of workers, a craft-like model. On the other hand, he could clearly see what was coming. He was well aware of the economic advantages for the owners of capital to simplify and mechanize labor in ways that drastically alter the pride that one could take in one's own standing, and so what he calls one's honor. The advantages, indeed, of eliminating all dependence on worker talent, the source of their standing in a corporation, but also the source of their bargaining power. One's expectations of being recognized as having worth, one's standing, is threatened by the internal dynamic essentially inherent in capitalism: the accumulation of surplus capital or wealth, the engine of growth itself. These aspects of a manufacturing economy, the deadening effects of factory routine, and the increasing simplification and de-skilling of the labor process, are obviously serious problems in a systematic account so focused on the social bases of the respect or recognition that is criterial for that particular universal relation that's supposed to count as limited but real justice in civil society. There are, of course, thinkers then and now who believe that any question about the justice and fairness of a competitive economic system, especially at the macro structural level, is inappropriate. The idea is that no one would ask whether it is right or fair that gambling or a foot race produces a few winners and many losers. Hegel is clearly not one of those thinkers, but he suggests no ways in which intervention by the state, I think, could ameliorate these problems, since, as he realizes, the trajectories are not incidental aspects of a capitalist economy, but essential. Competitiveness makes them, these consequences, inevitable. And one begins to worry about whether the deprivations and pathologies produced will be so severe that they make completely implausible the idea that one's role as a citizen, or even a member of a corporation, could reestablish that dignity and sense of worth inevitably destroyed by these conditions. Now, as we've been hearing, this is most famously the case with Hegel's account of the inevitability of poverty. But what's interesting is that, again, mostly in the lectures rather than in the philosophy of right itself, he has a number of things to say about the accumulation of great wealth within capitalism and its effect on the wealthy as well as on the poor. The premise for both accounts is that labor is essential in any society of actualized freedom. This is again part of his schema, that a particular subject must work to liberate herself from natural necessity, master abstract ideas and relations, experience subjective freedom, externalized in an objective product of and so expressive of her distinct talents and labor, and come to understand the nature of the dependence on others that the division of labor requires. This educative benefit does not occur through exchange or consumption, but through work and the positive educative experience of a vital dependence on others. The wealthy, however, or many of them, either do not work or do not need to work, and so don't have the same stake in the outcome of their labor. They live off their wealth, and for Hegel, they're severely spiritually impoverished because of this. They become mere consumers, an activity that for Hegel is without ethical standing, an activity that inspires no respect from others. They're just bloßen Konsumenten. What Hegel would have thought of an entire economy fueled by consumer goods, a Konsumgesellschaft, is easy enough to predict. Moreover, there are social dimensions to the position of the wealthy. They will inevitably tend, quote, to see themselves as no longer obliged to respect the rights of others, unquote, because of the obvious inequality in social standing. Why should I be treated the same way they are treated? He goes so far as to say that one, quote, one can also call it a depravity for Dorgenheit, that the rich person thinks that everything is allowed for him. Hegel thus anticipates the paradoxical phenomenon of ludicrously wealthy and privileged burghers who feel constantly aggrieved about the state seizure of their money and taxes, and who spend a great deal of money corrupting the political process to prevent such so-called seizures, and who often form common cause with the equally aggrieved disenfranchised poor, who can be easily manipulated by populist and nationalist sentiment. Finally, he goes so far as to claim, using the term he's famous for using about the poor, a rabble, purble, in describing a rich rabble, a Reichepurble. People united in their view that they have no stake in society and its common good, either because they regard themselves as above it or excluded from it. Since the accumulation of great wealth is both inevitable in a highly competitive market economy, and since its effects on ethical life are so dangerous, these would appear to be quite serious problems. And of course, equally serious are the problems we've discussed concerning poverty. But what's important is that in the lectures, Hegel seems to see very little chance that, given the basic premises of a market economy, the problem, as well as the problems caused by extreme wealth, can be fully solved. I should note that we have to pass over here the various empirical questions of whether Hegel is right or not that a regulatory and interventionist attempt to create, say, full employment, or to restrict competitiveness, or to insist on the upskilling of labor would necessarily, or even very likely, lead to overproduction. Since that's one of the greatest factors in poverty, it would make the problem worse. We just have to pass that over for the minute. And Hegel does not much discuss the fact that modern commodity production would not be possible if it did not also create values distinct to a market economy well beyond the general commitment to the value of freedom and some potential for solidarity. Capital for Hegel is just accumulated wealth. It doesn't become a value in itself, but it obviously does in capitalism, inverting Hegel's treatment of money as a mere means, as the ends of capitalism subordinate all human value, including the human value most important for Hegel, equality as mutual recognition. Anyone who ignores the value of maximizing profit for the sake of some such human end ensures their competitive disadvantage and eventual ruin. This issue all of this raises is clear and goes to the heart of what Hegel is trying to do. The question is, how are we to view what appear to be intractable and destructive ethical aspects of a market economy we would come to call by the mid-19th century capitalism? Given the problems he's focused on, his claim in the remark to 253 that the corporation's ability to mediate the effects of unemployment and poverty also eliminates its quote-unquote humiliating character, misses the point about the source of the humiliation and seems tone-deaf given what he himself has said. We recall that social and political systems that are regarded as grounded in putative ahistorical ideas are those that actually always simply reflect the level of self-knowledge available at a historical time. In the example of Plato in his Republic that he cites in the preface, justice was understood as threatened by the demand for the acknowledgement by some individual subject for standing and respect as the distinct individuals they are, not merely as fellow citizens. This tension was most obvious in the tension between eros, the love of one's own, and justice, dedication to a common good and to the rule of reason in politics. The assertion of the subject as having standing in itself was regarded as the assertion of mere inner caprice, whim, feeling, passion, and so forth. And the task of education was to sublimate such eros in favor of an organic identification with the politeia. But we can now see in Hegelian hindsight, as Hegel himself saw, that this principle of subjective standing was a world historically significant demand, a demand of reason manifest in historical time. Its emergence as a critical problem in the ancient world was a sign that the world would soon disappear under the pressure of an ever more self-conscious realization of that world's irrationality, something fully made manifest in Christianity. Well, Hegel, as we've seen, Hegel has interpreted a market economy, what would later be called capitalism, as unavoidably producing in the de-skilling trajectory of modern labor, something he was warning about well before Fordism or Taylorism, and among the chronically unemployed and the wealthy, a detachment from the only available social bases of self-respect and recognitive status, the labor process. As he puts it, quote, without the mediation of work, there would be no feeling of, quote, self-sufficiency and honor among its individual members. This is incidentally why contemporary works that claim a workless utopia as the goal of Hegelian thought, like Martin Hagelin's, are, let's just say, not credible. Given the constellation of Hegel's distinct claims about allegiance and therewith authority that we discussed at the outset, this creates a fatal problem in Hegel's own terms. Following Dean's interpretation of Hegel's theory of value, we could say that given the actual inferential consequences of institutional and economic life in civil society, it's hard to see how anything in those implications allows the passing over into new and reformative institutions and practices that Hegel relies on to advance his argument. Excuse me. Ensuring economic security at some minimal level cannot possibly educate workers in modern capitalism to their stake in each other in a way that creates anything like the solidarity Hegel's position on the nature of allegiance requires. And here we should stress that this problem is not a minor psychological issue when, say, compared with such material well-being, such issues as material well-being or simple security. The basic claim of Hegel's account, as we've been hearing all conference, is that there must be a logical relation between the independence and dependence among individuals in civil society, in economic activity, productive labor, management, and exchange. That is neither disjunctive nor a mere compromise, but that the educative experience of civil society can teach its members that true independence is not qualified by, but realized by a form of dependence. And that being dependent in the right way in a society with a division of labor is the achievement of independence. The key to this unusual claim is the experience of one's standing among one's fellow burghers. True to that idea, he tries to show, or at least to assert, that one's standing in an estate and in a more mediated way in corporations or work associations can preserve that recognitive status, even if wealthy or unemployed. Even though, he claims, civil society teaches one that in acting for himself, he is acting for others, this is, quote, not enough. Only in the corporation does it become a knowing and thinking part of ethical life, unquote. He places so much faith in the deep solidarity produced by such corporations, and of course I mean not just labor unions and their equivalent at the time, but any Gemeinde that is supposed to function this way, given the pathologies of the labor situation growing in capitalism, that he even argues that elections should be organized by corporations, that one should vote qua corporation members, so deeply tied is it to one's identity as an individual. And finally, he thinks that whatever residue of ethical damage is done by capitalism's relentless need to eliminate the bases of societal respect can all be decisively mediated by the political state eventually and one's experience of others as fellow citizens. And so we get typical claims about the state proper, like, quote, the end of the corporation, which is limited and finite, has its truth in the end, which is universal in and for itself and in the absolute actuality of this end in the state. So despite Hegel's apparent reluctance to put it this way, the question is whether the diagnosed situation is like the historical situation of Plato or is not. Is what Hegel has diagnosed a form of life confronted by what might seem to be problems of the sort that any finite, imperfect social and political system must confront as best it can? Or is it a form threatened in toto by what are really indications of a far deeper irrationality, a threat to the realization of freedom that announces the necessity of a major historical transformation? The threat is not wealth or poverty in itself for Hegel, just as the mechanization and simplification of the labor process is not the problem of tedium or boredom. On Hegel's view, market economies create massive incentives for the owners of capital to undertake measures that inevitably reduce the experienced bases of any contentful standing among one's fellow human beings, and so distorts any Bildung that might inspire a commitment to a common good or even ultimately participation in politics. From everything we have seen so far, I think it's impossible to avoid concluding that on Hegel's own terms, the situation he describes is a clear echo of the situation he claims Plato was facing. What we now call capitalism, generalized commodity production that everywhere assumes profit motive and the constraints of competition, are inconsistent with what I've been calling ethical standing that counts for Hegel as the basis of mutual respect. And so the experience of one's own worth have given Hegel's, what I've called in the written version, a substantive conception of rationality. This counts as deeply irrational. The experience of civil society is supposed to create this form of allegiance, but Hegel himself provides the evidence, even at this very early stage of industrial capitalism, that it cannot. Even though he doesn't put it this way, what I've been calling the problem of one's standing cannot be a regrettable but still acceptable one of a system of production that would still stand on balance as a concrete and objective actualization of freedom. This is because the question of mutuality is inseparable from Hegel's account of freedom itself, and thereby of the possibility of subjective allegiance. Hegel's account of responsible action is not a straightforward, intentional, causal account of agency, as Jean-Francois was pointing out this morning. His general standard for achieving freedom is that one must be able to see oneself in one's deeds, to experience them as one's own, another dimension of that general notion of being with self in another. This in turn requires a version of self-knowledge that he does not treat as a result of any complete transparency of the self to itself, but which is mediated by what one experiences one's deeds have come to mean to others and how they come to matter to others. And this requires social forms, institutions, in which this would be possible. I don't think he provides us the evidence that corporations or Stände could be those. Now, all of this may not be the right explanation of freedom, and there may still be a great deal of work to be done to explain the paradoxical claim that I cannot be free unless I am recognized as free in a concrete institutional way. But I think it's certainly Hegel's position, given his coupling of the essentiality of labor to human worth, together with Hegel's hesitations about whether this recognition is possible in a competitive system of production. This has to mean that the situation he describes is much like the one he assigns to Plato. In the case of Plato, the new principle was that right of subjectivity. In this case, the problem is the incompatibility of a productive system in which the constraints of competitiveness require the maximization of profit and the minimization of the costs of labor, with the real social bases of self-respect and the achievement of standing in the eyes of others necessarily threatened. Given how Hegel understands the concept of freedom, there is no way to avoid the conclusion that this form of the actualization of freedom, that form of labor, does not agree with its concept, the Hegelian mark of irrationality. The final question all this raises is obvious and has in fact been raised frequently by the new so-called dialectical materialist interpretation of Hegel. Is any resolution of this incompatibility consistent with the core elements of late industrial and finance global capitalism? This would largely depend on what one regards as those elements, or rather what they've become in the 200 years since the philosophy of right's appearance. And what they have become seems to me to make Hegel's picture of labor and a system of exchange very hard to recognize. So the answer would appear to be no. There's no way to reconcile these core elements with what Hegel regards as the essence of freedom. And all of this despite Hegel's own hopes for the corporations and the political states. It's not easy to understand how Hegel would want to retain what he regards as the positive socializing and educating effects of a market economy if, let us say, private ownership of the means of production were ended, or whether some radically reformist measure like worker control of the conditions of their labor, or worker design of production technology that takes into account the need to ensure the human dignity and social standing of workers. But the case I've tried to make is that Hegel's own account invites or even demands such speculation, and we shouldn't hesitate to hope that there are such possibilities building in the political pressures caused by the dissatisfaction so obvious today, and to see them as deeply consistent with Hegel's approach to historical actuality. Thank you.
Okay, let's open it up for questions. We have about half an hour, definitely no more than that. So go ahead and raise your hand. Okay, Sebastian Rand.
Hi, I have what's probably a somewhat marginal question. I mean, I find myself in a great deal of sympathy with your paper, but I wonder what you make of what Hegel goes on to say in one of the lectures that you quoted earlier in your presentation about the Abstumpfung that comes about as a result of mechanical labor. One of the things he says in that very lecture is that, the eventual end of this is that all the labor in the factory is going to be replaced by machines. And the result of that is the restoration of human freedom. And I mean, that sounds like it points toward the Hagelin type of response, although it's rare enough in the corpus to find. I mean, he has similarly somewhat naive things to say about other technological developments of his time, for instance, weapons technology and so on. But it's rare enough that I could see a strategy where you just say maybe he just felt too bad, condemning, like he didn't want to stand in front of his students and say you're all screwed. But but maybe not. So I'm just wondering how you handle that passage and similar ones.
Yeah, no, very good. That's absolutely what he does say. But it seems to me what he means is said in the context in which he doesn't believe that industrial production is going to be as significant in the production of wealth as it later developed in capitalism to be. I think he means, well, we've got this problem with factories. We've got divided labor that is so extensive that no worker dignity is possible, given how dispensable they've become. But let's just hope all that is solved by robots or machines or something like that. And then we have those, we have the agricultural class, we have civil servants, we have craft production, we have the society we know, and we're just gonna make sure that sort of generating the steel we need is going to be done by machines, and then the rest of it will, because the passages on the essentiality of labor to the actualization of one's freedom as a particular are manifold all over the place in the lectures. There's no indication that he thinks that the ideal is to eliminate work at all. I mean, my reaction to Hegel's book was something like, well, what is everybody supposed to do? Jet ski, play video games. What Hegelian picture is there of a world in which there's no connection between someone's productive activity and a product that's valued by others? He seems to think of that as essential. So I don't think we could say, well, because he says this about factories and because industrial production has become our form of life, he must mean that machines are going to do everything and we're not going to have anything to do. That's not anywhere close to the way Hegel normally seems to think about it. So I think he means to unrealistically marginalize the domain of factory production in an economy he thinks as potentially much more variegated and open to other sources of self-respect and respect by others that it turned out to be.
Yeah, I mean, just as a follow-up, it fits very well with that when he does contemplate briefly the automation of agriculture, he seems very uncomfortable with that idea, that entire, he says, well, so it's becoming more factory-like, and then he doesn't really give much reasoning here, but he just shifts immediately into, but it will never actually do that. Like it's something that sort of, he sort of stops. He's
definitely of two minds about all this, but he had to deal himself with the emergence of agribusiness as larger corporations started buying up peasant estates. He was very, very much opposed to it. Although again, this goes back to Stephen's paper. If corporations like or Stendo, like the agricultural class, are going to have the legal means to restrict the development of profit maximization by corporations, they're going to have to do it by the coercive power of the law. They're going to have to enforce it. They're going to have to do things that are contrary to what growing economic pressures within society are demanding. And that means the corporations are not really distinct from, certainly not the political state within civil society, the Polizei, but since ultimately that has to be sanctioned by the political state itself, since we're talking about the power of the law to regulate behavior, he's going to try to give the corporations a function that would have to do something like restrict the purchase of peasant land in order to sort of preserve in the aspects of peasant life that he likes. This is like the big Germany, little Germany debate he was so involved in. So on the one hand, he seems kind of anachronistic and naive about what he thinks legal regulation can do. And on the other hand, he has a kind of terror of what's coming.
Okay, next question, Lydia.
Thank you so much. And I should say my internet is really glitchy, so I'm hoping I can get through this. But thank you so much for that as a diagnosis of the current moment and a testament to how powerful Hegel is as a tool for diagnosing our current moment. So compelling. I had a question about how you think Hegel thought it could have worked if we were to have had a political structure more like the one he envisions. And specifically, I was so glad to be reminded, as you say here, that part of the idea of elections for Hegel and representation, political representation, was supposed to go through the corporations.
I lost you.
So the idea is that when I want to be politically represented, it doesn't make that much sense for me to think that I have the most in common with other people living in Maine, but that myself as a very clearly tied up with my, the corporation or the class that I'm a part of. So I just wonder if you could say some more about how you think he envisioned that kind of economic representation and therefore allegiance being carried up into political allegiance in the state, and the extent to which that could have bridged some of these issues. Yeah. It's especially given that when he talks about patriotism, it's definitely, which would be a political kind of allegiance. It's, as Jay was talking about yesterday, it's definitely a kind of constitution also bound up with the way the nation becomes a state, so the cultural inheritance within the political inheritance as well. So I wondered if you could just say a little more about how you think that could have worked from his point of view.
Well, I mean, here we should have turned over the floor to Chris Yeomans, who's done the most work to try to understand how this might look, to go to the frame of your question, how, given all these problems, but yeah, how might it look if we tried to fit the Hegelian desiderata into the contemporary economic situation of globalized finance capitalism. And it does make sense to think that there's some virtue in regarding political participation as more than, a kind of amorphous mass of voters in an arbitrarily gerrymandered district voting for in a simple majority vote. But part of the problem of, this goes back to Foster's old wonderful book about Plato and Hegel. Part of the problem of Hegel's conception of legislation is that it's not what we think of as legislative creation. It's a much more expressivist model of legislation, in which the idea of the legislation is to express the common political character of the community that already exists, rather than to create it. Rather than to create, the law actually just sanctifies the expression. So it's not even very easy to imagine a political process in which something like the significance of one's standing as a worthy member of the labor situation could be expressed in what we now think of as the contentious interest group politics of ordinary major governmental life, even at the community level. So it can't look like interest group compromise. First, because he doesn't have that notion of legislative will, and he's much more like Plato in that respect. And secondly, because interest group compromise is not what a Hegelian desideratum should be like. Not to mention the fact that there's so much de-skilled labor. The idea of a corporation of Walmart greeters or something like that doesn't make any sense within what Hegel is asking of the labor process. And not to mention what Elizabeth Anderson indicates are the control that corporations like Apple and Microsoft and Amazon and Walmart have over their employees, down to the level of how they may dress, what they may say to each other, how they may interact with each other, whether they may go to the bathroom, whether they may not go to the bathroom. The accounts she gives of both productive and non-productive or service labor are horrifying. So the idea that and even just the general idea of the corporations as a compensatory mechanism for all of this, I mean, it seems inevitable to me that psychologically, when people got unemployed, Hegel thinks, well, the corporation will take care of them. the solidarity in the corporation, but there's bound to be resentment by the unemployed at those who by some chance are employed. And there's bound to be the problem if there's a common pool of money, as in labor unions, to see you through a strike or something like that. The idea that being unemployed as an individual and being given sustenance by the corporation to maintain your standard of living would create the same kind of sort of welfare dependence that Hegel thinks is injurious to your standing as, a worthy being in that society. So it's very hard for me to imagine how that's going to fit both with the contemporary notion of interest group politics and with the very limited space left in modern industrial production for what Hegel was interested in the source of self-respect within recognition of one's worth as a laborer.
Okay, next up is Stephen.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. That was great. I wanted to ask you, in a way, this is probably a bit unfair, but to speculate a little bit more about what you yourself might propose, given our broken situation. Because I'm going to start off from the idea that the thought you put forward that mutuality is not compatible with a market economy based on maximizing wealth, I think absolutely, I completely agree with you. I think that was completely clear. But then it seems to me there are three options. Option one, we can't do anything about it, we're screwed. Option two, we eliminate the market altogether in one of a variety of ways. One of them is a Marxian way. One can have, another way of returning to a pre-industrial world. The other way, the third way, is in some sense reforming the market so that it's not eliminated, but it's not pure anymore. So we're not talking anymore about maximizing wealth. We're talking about an ethical market. Now, I think that's Hegel's solution. And obviously I've explained that I think the corporations play a role in that. You don't think the corporations are going to manage that. So I'm kind of wondering what you think does, or do you think one of the other options is the one we've got to take? I'm hoping you're going to say no, some way of rendering a market economy ethical so that it's not a pure market economy is possible, but I'd like you to say a little bit more. Obviously, I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm not saying, I'm not saying give us a whole theory, but some basic ideas as to where you might go if now you've referred us to Chris, and obviously, Chris has his ideas too. I'm kind of keen to see what you have to say about this.
Yeah, I'm much more pessimistic than Chris. I choose option one.
We're screwed. Seriously.
Yeah. Let me to be more serious. Yeah, seriously. But with regard to your suggestion, which is a good one, it goes back to the point I was making to Lydia that I suppose many of the things you're saying about how it would help to have the corporations play the political role that you're suggesting they play, because anything that counts as an amelioration of these conditions in sort of the limit, corporate tax rates that are fair, or health and safety regulations within the factory that are much stronger. All of those are going to require the creation of the political will to create the enforcement mechanisms that are going to allow corporations to have that kind of political standing such that they can influence the generation of legislation, something like that. But the problem is, of course, that's going to generate competitiveness with the interests of other Gemeinde or corporations, and we're going to have a picture that looks a little bit like what it is today. And when you especially consider the role of money in politics and the exorbitant imbalance in the amount of money and power available to massive corporations and their ability to buy off politicians, and you could say, well, you're choosing one because you're an American. And this version of, either succeed or lie down in the gutter and die capitalism is unique to America, that if you look at Northern Europe or Britain 50 years ago or something like that, you could, but that all requires, especially for Hegelian, no kind of top-down solution. There's got to be the creation of the political will that actually restricts accumulation of capital for the sake of an ethical market. But I don't see any indication whatsoever that there is any hope for the creation of such a political will.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you. Just one final remark. You in your paper, but also in your responses, you slide, if I can put it that way, from using the term corporation to refer to, I think, what Hegel's got in mind, the Gemeinde, but then you also called Apple a corporation. Now, obviously, Apple is not a corporation in,
Yeah, I'm
in
sorry.
Hegel's sense.
Yeah, you're absolutely
Okay.
right. I should have said a business. I should have said a business.
Right,
Yeah.
because
No, that's
just,
our
okay,
own.
that's fine.
Yeah, corporatism in that sense. So, going back to the Spanish Civil War and everything, it has all kinds of different meanings. But that was a slip. You're quite right.
Okay, all right, good.
Apple
but
is
thank
not
you
a
anyway, Robert.
corporation. Apple is the anti-corporation.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, thank you. Good. Okay, that's great. Thanks a lot.
Okay, Viren is next.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I really enjoyed it. And I'm a little hesitant to ask this question because you responded to Stephen's question with number 1, which sort of gives me a sort of slightly blocks my question. But let me, I wanted to come back to something you said on page 24, which is that you talk about how a particular form of actualization of freedom doesn't agree with its concept. And that is, to me, I read that as basically our present form of capitalism, right? And in the way that it doesn't in some sense, it doesn't agree with the form of freedom that Hegel is talking about. So then this, to me, immediately brings up the question of, well, what form of society would actually agree with that, right? And a number of people have been offering different suggestions. I think, even in the past couple of decades, we've seen interpretations of the philosophy of right that say, yeah, we can have, I'm thinking of people like, Neuhauser was mentioned. I think you've also got Hardimon. They all were basically saying, well, you've got you can have the structure of the philosophy of right, but without capitalism, right? And so that in that sense, you would have civil society, but civil society doesn't necessarily mean capitalism. And it seems like the whole thrust of your paper was pointing in that direction, that we've come to a historical moment. And this goes back, I guess, to what Lydia Gur was saying yesterday about, how we are now in a historical moment where we can see that there are certain contradictions and problems, the way in which, there's a systematic undermining of what Hegel calls freedom. And yet there's the possibility of creating something new. I mean, this is where I think Hegel is going, and you might be critical of where he's going, because what he's basically done is taken Marx's Grundrisse and then slapped it onto Hegel, right? But there could be other ways, and so I was wondering about whether you'd could say something about that. I mean, so that we wouldn't have to choose option 1, that we could say, because it may be too soon to choose option. I mean, I'm a little nervous about option 1.
Yeah.
Okay, we have to try to keep it as sort of concise as possible.
Okay. So let me. It certainly ought to be the case that if one is sympathetic with Hegel, one should be able to detect in the kind of pathologies that the humiliating character of the modern labor situation and unemployment produces should be of themselves suggesting, in a kind of internal or determinate negation sense, what we should be thinking of doing and actually creating the pressure for doing it. I mean, the manifestations of the pathology, from Trump all the way down to deaths of despair and the opioid epidemic, there are suicide rates, there's just manifold pieces of empirical evidence that the lack of standing in this sense, there's a tendency to treat this as all a matter of the psychological effects of capitalism. But I think what Hegel is pointing to is that there's something in at least in the form, especially now, of globalized capitalism, that make the idea of the philosophy of right without capitalism very, very difficult to imagine. I mean, when there was an international socialist economy prior to 1989, countries that at least aspired to eliminate societies where wealth creation was a matter of consumption and where profit maximization and de-skilling of the labor force were essential to that. They had trading partners. They could circulate in some form of international trade in a way that wouldn't create the pressure on them that a full economic competition in the international marketplace would have created. But that's why it's so hard for Cuba or North Korea to function as economies in any international sense. They have no products anybody wants to buy, and so their position in the world economy is so marginalized because you just can't have one socialist country. So in the condition, Stephen alluded to this as well, if you introduce the competitive demands of a globalized free trade, you could say we should go back. We should reinstitute tariffs. We should protect local economies. We should, but that has to happen in a way all at once, or the reliance of individual economies on international trade now would make a kind of unilateral withdrawal from the international competitive market, a kind of impoverishing of the wealth of a country that would create political problems. The prices of TVs would go way up and people would be, demonstrating in the streets. So it's even more difficult now to imagine, since Hegel doesn't, he's not fond of nation states. He's not that kind of a thinker, but he does believe in there being, distinct political unities at the political level, states. And he does believe in the necessity of thinking the consequences of an international order of economic regulation for the individual economies of it. So the idea of extracting capitalism in the international situation we're in right now seems to me a kind of pipe dream. Now, is it possible to think that, given that Hegel is right, that there will be political pressure building in the dissatisfactions that this lack of think of how often the question of respect, humiliation, the number of murders that are now, particularly in the States, the result of the experience of even minor acts of disrespect, the enormous profile arising of the importance of this question that plays a role in Hegel's system that I don't think it plays hardly anywhere else. The second half of Theory of Justice in Rolfe, he does talk quite a lot about the social bases of self-respect, but nobody ever reads that part or discusses it anymore. It's actually quite an important part of that book, but it doesn't have the resonance it has anymore because it just seems so hopeless. So if you go back to your original question, why not just take out capitalism? Not in a globalized, internationally competitive market without there being some sort of worldwide adjustment in the free trade system to make that possible. I'm disturbed by number one too. But I don't think there's enough indication of the determinate direction arising out of this crisis that gives anyone any hope for optimism. We're probably going to elect Trump again in 2024. We're going to lose Congress. We're going to lose the House and the Senate in 2022. And this is all the product of pathology and, predictable by Hegel in a certain way. But it's not determinate negation. It's the immiseration of the situation.
Okay. So we have 6 minutes and 3 questions. Please keep it as short as possible. Mark, you're up next.
Okay, we're talking a lot about hopelessness here. Let's get out of the negative moment of reason and get to the positive moment of reason. What we're working on is taking what we're talking about in this conference and making it actual and addressing that question directly, so we don't have to choose option one. This new option is WEWA, the Worldwide Essential Workers App, where I mean essential not necessarily by the pandemic workers, but essential as in the doctrine of essence, where everybody's essential. This has to be worldwide because markets are created by the unknown. And that even modern economics shows that the difference between poor and rich states is discovery, research and development, and commercialization. That is the process of self-recognition that Hegel's talking about. We need an app that is going to operate on that level. We have to do research and development ourselves in the app as part of the workers' labor. And then we commercialize that as the redistribution of wealth back to the workers as a cooperative social enterprise. That's what's missing on the corporate model worldwide. Don't go the political route. Governments are totally taken over. research has shown that voting has zero effect on legislation. So we have to do this on the corporate kind of structure that you're talking about, Holgate. We need to have this WeWa app go worldwide. The workers own it. We do this research. We distribute it back to ourselves through these goods and services. And I'm wondering, do you think that's a realistic option as a sort of like exponentially fast growing to compete with things like Uber, which has this kind of spirit, which doesn't respect workers? They're so far above
Okay,
us. So do you think you can
enough.
embrace that, Robert Pippin?
Well, I appreciate the note of potential hope. I don't share it, but I see what you're saying. I don't think.
I'm going on a hunger strike to death here. I might be dead in 6
Well,
days.
yeah,
We got
enough
very little
now.
time.
All power to you, but I'm not sure that. I mean, it would be nice. It actually makes my point that a socialist revolution has to be a worldwide socialist revolution, and there have to be the material conditions necessary for that to occur. Unfortunately, those
It's too
material
abstract. It's
conditions
got to be
Okay,
higher.
please
have to be
stop
something like
interrupting.
a
Go ahead,
worldwide
Robert.
economic collapse of such calamity that going on as we've always gone on doesn't seem possible. That would be the level of the French Revolution, or the disappearance of the Athenian polis, or any of the things that Hegel can mark out in history as these Wendepunkte. But I don't see any of that coming.
Okay, our next question is Jake.
Hi, thanks. I really enjoyed this talk, and just to keep it brief, because Andrea said we're running low on time, I have a simple question, although it's one I've struggled with, so I'm curious what you think. And it's basically whether there are actually capitalists in anything like Marx's sense in Hegel's rational state or Hegel's civil society. So to give you an idea what I'm thinking about, this is the person who hurls money into the production process and gets it back again with interest, MCM prime. The investor class. This is a kind of parasite, really, because they don't work. They're paid for what they own. Is that the way Hegel thinks of the rich? Aren't the rich for Hegel a little more like what I learned they were in my neoliberal economics class in college, which is that they're entrepreneurs, they're innovators, they attract they're educated, they're whatever. I always kind of thought Hegel had that latter view. And then my further thought is, maybe that's not so bad, because the figure of the capitalist as Marx represents it, and a sort of Soviet propaganda, giant fat guy on top of a pile of gold, it doesn't really ring true in the modern world. This idea that, well, Elon Musk is the idle rich, or he's just living off his investments. How does that strike you? It sounded to me like you were trying to, in a way, lend Hegel a helping hand by saying he's got the capitalist, and I'm sort of thinking, well, maybe he doesn't, and maybe that's not so bad.
Well, I would go back one step and say what bothers Hegel is not so much how they got their money, it's the effect of money, the effect of vast amounts of money on their own sense of their relation to the political world, that it creates a rabble. And you're right that he probably thought of the creation of wealth not as stolen labor or anything like that. He probably thought of it as in some sense earned, although there's very little political notion of entitlement issues in Hegel. I mean, except in the early stages of the discussion of property and the entitlement to alienate your property for the sake of a contractual benefit. But so there's no real sense of, at least in Hegel, of finance capitalism, and he does tend to think of the wealthy property, capitalism, relatively late term. Let's say the wealthy property owner as having something like the status you say, as having earned wealth, something like that. He probably thinks of that, but he does think the consequences of having so much wealth are destabilizing socially, because they both withdraw the wealthy from participation in politics and create a corruption in them, in which they seek to protect their money by influencing the political process in a way that Hegel could not possibly even have imagined, especially in the United States. So that is more the problem for him than the source of their wealth, and any kind of anticipation of a finance class having so much power over the global economic market right now. That's a problem his head would explode.
So you think Hegel it's really Marx who's more right about who the 1% are, or who the ultra rich are today, as opposed to Hegel?
He could see
some people
more.
Might say Hegel's right.
Yeah, he could see more of what was coming. Sure, yeah. Money made off money.
Thanks.
Okay, great. Please join me in thanking Robert.
Thank you all very much.
And we will now take a 5-minute break and return at 11, or actually, I guess it's Eastern time, so 2:05. I'm on the West Coast, so see you in 5 minutes.